On the morning of October 31st, 1929, the hallway of the tenement on West 18th Street in Pilsen still held the smell of boiled cabbage and wet coal when the news began to move before any radio voice crossed the building. It was a long hallway with worn floorboards, weak bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and doors so close together that the sigh of a bed could pass through the wood. The air came heavy with the stale dampness of a basement and that fine dust that gathers where many people pass in boots still wet from the street. At that hour, what was at stake was not a street corner rumor or bar talk. It was the following week, Sunday's pot, the overdue rent, the blanket over the children when the lake wind pushed cold under the windows, a cold that in Chicago came in through cracks and ill-fitted panes and made the water in the bucket seem colder than it was. The mother who stopped in the middle of the hallway with a wash basin in her arms, Maria Kowalski, could not afford to wait for an afternoon paper to decide whether she would buy flour or hide coins at the bottom of the biscuit tin. A newspaper cost cents, and in that kind of house, cents were born with a destination. The factory where her husband worked, Western Electric in Cicero, was the line that held up the two-room apartment. If that line snapped, the rest came with it, because the weekly pay tied together rent, coal, and credit of the grocer. And the news that morning did not come printed or announced by anyone important. It came from a neighbor's mouth, door to door, with the speed of a fire that starts at the baseboard and climbs without asking permission. Maria was 29, hands reddened by cheap soap and a way of listening that came from years of saving words. The smell of soap mixed with that of boiled laundry and reused wash water. The tenement was an old building of darkened brick, narrow stairs, and a yard where children ran between clotheslines and ash cans, and where one always saw, leaned against a wall, the pile of coal or slag left over from stoves and heaters, with fine ash scattered as if the ground never finished getting dirty. Her husband, Stanislav, left before the sun and came back with metal dust stuck to his clothes, always a little more bent than the week before. His clothes carried the smell of industrial oil and boiler smoke that did not come out in a single wash. That Thursday, he had left earlier still because the rumors about the crash in New York had made the supervisors tighten the pace, and tightening became hurry at the gate, harder looks, less tolerance for lateness. Maria did not know what the stock market was, but she knew how to recognize a man's silence when he sat at the table and did not ask for coffee, and she knew that a silence like that came from fear of losing what still seemed fixed. In the hallway, by the door to 3B, Mrs. Nowak appeared with her apron full of flour, as if she had been pulled away from dough that was rising, and the flour marked the fabric like chalk dust. She did not knock. She only set her hand against the wood of Maria's door and said in a low tone, like someone trying not to startle a child, "It's going to close." She did not say the name of the factory. She did not need to. Almost all the men in that part of the neighborhood had the same badge, the same dented lunch pail, the same bus that went down Ogden Avenue towards Cicero, or they combined streetcar and walking depending on the day's money. The route was as certain a routine as the whistle at the start and end of the shift. Maria stood still with the basin in her arms. Water ran down the cloth and dripped onto the floorboards, forming a puddle that soon mixed with the hallway dust. "Close when?" she asked, and the question came out with a precision that seemed to contain the rest of the entire day, as if she needed to pin down a date so as not to let fear turn into fog. Mrs. Nowak's eyes were wet, but steady. They said at the gate, "Cuts, then close." Anna's brother heard it from a foreman. "Today, tomorrow, before winter." She looked over her shoulder down the hallway, as if the very word winter could be overheard, because winter there meant more coal, more bills, more sickness. It's going around. Better to know than to wait. And with that, the sentence became movement. The news did not stay put, did not settle. It kept walking, pushed by necessity. The news moved like evacuation orders in a house on fire. The door to 3C opened, then 2A, and soon there were hurried footsteps, pots abandoned on the stove, contained crying, lids clanging on iron stovetops, and water being dumped in haste. Someone ran down the stairs to catch her husband before he got on the streetcar. Someone else went down with a baby in her arms and no coat, her head covered by a scarf that was no longer enough against the wind rising from the street. There was a radio in 2 apartments in the building, but that morning no one waited for the static and the distant voice. The information had the weight of a hand on the shoulder, warm and immediate, and it ran faster than any bulletin. Maria went back inside, set the basin on the floor, and for a moment looked at the pine table, the 2 chairs, the window with the cracked pane, a crack she had already tried to cover with paper and improvised tape. In the corner, the iron stove gave off weak heat, fed with ration coal and ash removed with a small shovel. In the next room, Helena, 7, drew on a sheet of wrapping paper. Little Yosef, 3, played with an empty tin, pushing it across the floor and laughing at the metallic sound that echoed in the boards. Maria did not raise a hand to her mouth or sit down to cry. She opened the drawer where she kept the bills and her notebook and counted the money the way one counts days, mentally separating what was food, what was coal, what was rent, and what simply did not exist. Uncertainty already had a name, but it still did not have a date. And while it had no date, it had to fit into numbers. That neighborhood held itself up on routines. The distant noise of the elevated train, the factory whistles, the bell of St. Adalbert. The routines had already been under pressure for weeks from talk about men losing everything in Manhattan, but that had seemed distant, like rain in another state, something of paper and of people who had stocks in banks. Now the distance shrank until it fit in the tenement hallway. Maria thought about the rent due in 3 days. She thought about coal sold in heavy sacks on the corner and the literal weight of carrying it up the stairs. She thought about the thin soup she had already been stretching with water and the bread that had to last longer than it lasted. What had been worry became calculation, and calculation, in that moment, was a form of defense. By late morning, the news found Stanislav before he came back. He entered the apartment with a gray face, grayer than metal dust, and that gray also seemed like shift fatigue and fear. He did not take off his coat. He set the lunch pail on the table as if it had become useless. Maria watched his eyes, which avoided hers, as if looking would admit what was not yet written anywhere, but already weighed on the body. They sat at the gate, he said, and there was no I in the sentence, only the raw fact. 1 shift is going next week. Then more. They promised nothing. The sentence carried no future. It carried only the removal of what had once seemed guaranteed. Maria closed the account notebook calmly. The rent is due Sunday. It was a sentence that pinned the world in place, because Sunday did not change because of a rumor or because of a fall anywhere. He nodded, almost without moving. Mr. Klein of the store said he'll give credit only until Saturday. After that, everyone will ask. And everyone, there was literal. The whole neighborhood depended on the credit ledger when money failed, and when everyone asked at the same time, the ledger became a limit. The radio in apartment 4A began to hiss that night, and a male voice, with the diction of someone reading from paper, spoke of panic, market, fall. The sound crossed the ceiling and ran down the walls, mixed with static and interference that made the words seem even more distant. In the tenement, however, no one argued about stocks or banks. They argued about work hours, sacks of potatoes, the price of milk on Halsted Street. And milk was something you bought in a bottle or a can when you could, and it spoiled quickly in a home without ice. In the hallway, Women sat on the stair steps to trade information as if trading recipes. Which church was handing out bread? Which boss still needed people? Which store would accept payment in 2 installments? Maria listened in silence. With Yosef asleep in her lap and Helena leaning against her leg, eyes attentive, as if learning early were a way not to fall. There, uncertainty became a net, fragile, but real, made of street names and schedules. It was there, at the end of that week, that the first impulse appeared that was not only to survive, the idea of hiding something from herself to protect the others. On Saturday, November 2nd, Maria went to the pawn shop on Blue Island Avenue with a small box wrapped in cloth. Inside was a simple necklace of dark beads that had belonged to her mother. It was not a display case jewel, but it was the only thing that had no practical function and, for that reason, had value. It could become quick money when everything else had already been cut. The man behind the counter, in shirt sleeves and suspenders, weighed the necklace as if weighing meat, judging by touch and eye, and wrote something in a book. He offered little. Maria accepted without arguing, because arguing would not increase the value and would delay her return. She went home with folded bills and the feeling of having torn away a piece of something that would not come back, because that was what pawning was, a promise of return that almost never came true when winter tightened and urgency ate up the margin. On Sunday, Stanislav went to Western Electric even without a shift, to see if there was a list. He came back with a crumpled paper in his pocket and a look that avoided the mirror. His name was among those dismissed in the first cut. The date was November 9th. 1 week. Maria read the paper without touching it, as if the ink could stain, and the paper had the weight of an order without a personal signature, only the coldness of a list. In that moment, something changed in the way the air in the apartment seemed to go in and out. The home was no longer only a place one occupied. It was a place that had to be defended with bills and with work, as if it were a border. Uncertainty now had a date, and the date became a countdown. The following weeks made the tenement hallway feel more crowded and quieter at the same time. Men who used to leave early now sat on the front step, smoking until the cigarette burned their fingers, and the cheap smoke left a smell that clung to clothes. Some tried to find short jobs at the Randolph Street Market, carrying crates for a few coins, fighting for a spot with other men in the same condition. Others went down to the docks on the Chicago River and came back with nothing, empty-handed and tight-faced. Women lined up at butcher shops to ask for bones, not meat, and bones were boiled until there was no taste left. Winter arrived with a wind off the lake as if it passed through glass. The poorly sealed windows let in a constant draft. Maria nailed newspapers into the cracks with flour and water, and the homemade paste smelled like bread that did not exist. The newsprint darkened with damp and left ink on her fingers, as if even the attempt to protect the home demanded a price. In December, St. Paul's Church, near 18th Street, organized a soup distribution. Maria brought a pot and stood in line with other women, feeling the hard ground under her boots, and the cold rose from the pavement as if it entered through the bones. The soup was thin but hot. That warmth felt, for a few minutes, like a practical promise, a few hours without stomach pain. Helena held the hem of her mother's coat and looked at people's faces as if searching for signs of danger. Her nose was already turning red in the wind. Yosef whimpered from hunger and sleep. Maria kept her eyes down and the pot steady. When she returned to the tenement, she climbed the stairs carefully so as not to spill. The smell drew people to the door. She shared with Mrs. Nowak, who had a cough and a newborn baby, and with old Mr. O'Brien in 1C, who lived alone and had no teeth left. It was not announced charity. It was silent calculation. Share today to have someone tomorrow who would knock with a piece of coal, or with useful information, or with a favor that prevented a bigger fall. Survival there was made of small exchanges, almost invisible, but decisive. The moral catalyst presented itself on the night of December 17th, when Mr. Klein, the owner of the corner grocery, came to knock at the apartment with his coat open and the credit ledger in his hand. He was not cruel. He was a man trying to keep his own business going, paying suppliers and the rent on the storefront, and the ledger was the way to control what had already gone out without money. He spoke without raising his voice, but each word had the firmness of a receipt. No payment by Friday, no more. Maria nodded, holding the door half closed so the cold would not come in. Stanislav stood behind her, still, as if his presence could change nothing, and his stillness was also shame. The deadline, spoken softly, sounded like a sentence because there was no room for error. After the man left, Stanislav took his coat and said he would find a way. Maria did not ask where. The way he said it reminded her of the men she saw coming back late, with red eyes and the smell of drink, trying to cover humiliation, with the heavy body of someone who spent what little he had to forget for a few hours. He went out and down the stairs without looking back. Maria stayed with the children and with a silence that made noise, because the whole building seemed to listen, and because when a man leaves like that, the whole hallway understands a decision was made at the limit. In the early hours, the hallway heard hurried steps and a muffled argument. Someone knocked on the door of 2A. Then a woman screamed, not loudly, but with that urgency that passes through walls. Maria opened her door only a crack and saw, at the end of the hallway, Mr. O'Brien fallen near the stairs, his head against the step, his body twisted like a coat thrown down. Mrs. Nowak was kneeling beside him, trying to call his name. Breathe, please breathe. The air smelled of cheap alcohol and smoke, and in the closed hallway the smell seemed stronger, as if it had soaked into the wood. The old man did not breathe. A man ran down a call for help, but help always took time to arrive in that part of the city, and the waiting time was a known fact in neighborhoods where you counted more on a neighbor than on a service. When they finally brought a stretcher, the body was already cold. No one said he died right away. There was only a drawing inward, a way of looking at the floor as if the floor could explain. Maria saw the old man's hand, with dark nails, and noticed he was holding a piece of hard bread, as if he had tried to eat on the way. Later, someone said he had slipped on the stairs after drinking, that he was weak, that his heart could not take it. The exact cause did not matter. The irreversible fact was that a man in the building, who had always been there like an old piece of furniture, now was not. And his death made the tenement understand, without speeches, the size of the hole opening up, because death there was not newspaper news. It was an absence on the step, a door that did not open, the hallway becoming a little narrower. The next morning, the landlady, Mrs. Donnelly, appeared with a black scarf on her head and a clipboard. She did not go to the wake. She went into the hallway to say the old man's apartment would be rented again, because bills don't wait. She spoke softly but firmly, and the clipboard was the tool of someone who managed lateness and collection as routine. Maria watched the world continue moving even though a body had gone out downstairs. The morality of the place, if it existed, was made of small acts, not big decisions. Maria felt an anger with nowhere to go and turned the anger into a plan, because anger without a plan became only fatigue, and fatigue was what winter wanted from her. On Friday, December 20th, Maria took Helena to the public school on 19th Street and asked to speak with the teacher. She waited in the school corridor, hearing the sound of children reciting letters, the echo of footsteps, and the creak of waxed floors. When she was received, Maria asked about clothing, about any aid program. The teacher, a young woman with her hair pinned up, said some families were receiving donations of coats and shoes through a local committee. She took a paper and wrote down an address on Maxwell Street, where an association distributed used clothing. Maria thanked her with a nod and left. The paper felt too light for what it promised, but it was a direction, and direction was what was missing when everything became waiting, and when waiting by itself paid nothing. The next day, she went to Maxwell Street early, with Yosef wrapped in a blanket and Helena holding her hand. The market was full of voices, vendors, the smell of fish and cloth. The ground was mud and trampled snow, and the air mixed cheap food with used clothing. The association operated in a plain building, with a wooden door and a small sign. Inside, women folded clothes and wrote down names, recording in notebooks as if it were an improvised office. Maria stood in line and saw hollow-eyed people, men without hats in the cold, children with red noses. When it was her turn, a woman asked the children's sizes and handed over a coat for Helena, too big, and a pair of thick socks. For Yosef, a wool cap. Maria took them and held them as if they were fragile objects. She did not cry there. She only felt her body loosen a little, as if she had been allowed to breathe, because warm clothing meant less illness and less expense. And less expense was a kind of victory that did not appear in headlines. The next winter advanced with dirty snow piled on the sidewalks, and job cuts became normal. Stanislav tried everything. He carried sacks at the market, cleared snow in front of a shop on Halsted, did small repairs for a man with a workshop. Nothing lasted. He came home with cracked hands and a coin or two. Sometimes he came back with nothing and said nothing. Maria began waking before dawn to go to neighborhood houses to wash laundry, scrub floors, sew hems, work paid by the piece or by the day, depending on need and trust. The smell of soap and cold water sank into her hands, and her skin opened in small fissures that burned when they touched water. She kept the money in a tin hidden behind a loose board near the stove. She did not tell Stanislav how much came in. It was not punishment. It was fear that, on a night of desperation, he would spend it to forget, because forgetting cost money and did not feed anyone, and because she had already learned that money, when it appears, has to be protected from panic itself. In February, the tenement hallway fell ill. The cough that had already been circling spread like smoke. Feverish children, adults with wheezing chests, and the heavy air of a crowded apartment with windows closed to hold heat helped the sickness stay. Mrs. Nowak lost the baby, too small to withstand the cold and the lack of milk. There was no ambulance. There was a white sheet and a simple box. Maria helped wash Mrs. Nowak's clothes, not out of declared pity, but because the whole building seemed to have been struck, and any gesture was a way of holding up the walls. Helena, in the oversized coat, watched everything with a new silence, as if childhood were being pushed into a corner, and her silence was learning without a lesson, a discipline that came from seeing too much. At the beginning of March, Stanislav began going out at night with a group of men who met near a corner on 21st Street. Maria could tell by the way he avoided explaining that it was not work. One night, he came back with a cut lip and a swollen eye. He said he had fallen. Maria cleaned the blood with a cloth and did not ask again. What she knew from the hallway was that men were being paid to watch things in storage places, to move boxes from one place to another without asking questions, and that this grew where regular employment had vanished. Prohibition was still in effect, and alcohol ran under the city like a hidden river, in bottles and barrels that changed hands in cars. In normal times, Maria would have shut the door and pushed her husband away from it. But rent, coal, food, the credit ledger, everything pushed in the opposite direction, with the force of an overdue bill that accepted no excuse. The irreversible event that would change the apartment came on the afternoon of March 14th, a day of cutting wind and clear sky. Stanislav left early saying he had a job. Maria was in the yard hanging sheets, and the cloth snapped in the wind like a flag. Wooden clothespins bit into the fabric hard, as if they too wanted to hold something in place. Around 3 o'clock, there was noise in the street. A car braking, voices, running steps. Then a hard knock at the tenement door. Maria went up the stairs with her heart beating in the rhythm of the boots she heard in the hallway. Boots that were not a neighbor's. Boots that carried a kind of news that does not spread by whisper. 2 police officers stood there, hats damp with sweat despite the cold, with a man in a suit behind them writing something down. They asked for the name Stanislav Kowalski. Maria did not say me. She only nodded, and the confirmation seemed to open a crack in the floor. One of the officers spoke without cruelty, with the hurry of someone who had more doors to knock on. Her husband had been injured in a shooting near a warehouse in Cicero, in the Cermak Road area. He had been taken to the county hospital, Cook County Hospital, on West Harrison Street. The officer did not say whether he was alive or dead. He only said she needed to go, as if need were an administrative order and as if life, in that neighborhood, were a sequence of orders no one chose to receive. Maria left Helena with Mrs. Nowak and went out with Yosef in her arms, without time to take more than a shawl. She took one streetcar, then another, and the city passed by the window in blocks of brick, smoke, and dirty snow, with chimneys releasing steam and streets where men stood on corners with no clear destination. Cook County Hospital was large, with corridors that smelled of disinfectant and boiled laundry, and the movement was that of a public institution. Too many people, groans, nurses walking fast, stretchers coming and going, and waiting as part of care. Maria waited in one line, then on a hard chair. When they finally took her, she saw Stanislav on an iron bed, pale, his chest bandaged. He was breathing, but each breath seemed pulled from far away, as if the air had become too heavy to pass through the body. The doctor said short words. Bullet, lung, possible infection. He would remain, if he survived, with limitations. Heavy work, no. The doctor did not speak of justice or crime. He spoke of body, fever, risk, and the rest belonged to another corridor, another door, another list. Stanislav did not die that night, but their life as it had been ended there. He stayed in the hospital for weeks. Maria went when she could, spending streetcar coins that were missed, and brought an apple when she managed, because fruit was expensive in winter, and even so, it seemed like something that kept someone tied to the world, a simple proof that care still existed. His face, once hardened by pride, took on a fragility Maria had never seen. He tried to speak and coughed. Sometimes he closed his eyes as if he wanted to erase the sound of the corridor, the stairs, the credit ledger, as if the world could fit again into an ordinary week with factory whistles and a sure wage. But the body, now, was the new accounting, and there was no way to hide the result. At home, the tenement helped as it could. Mrs. Nowak watched the children when Maria went out. A man from 4B fixed the cracked window without charging, adjusting the glass and reinforcing the frame to hold back the wind. In exchange, Maria washed shirts for him and for 2 others. The hallway that had spread the news of the factory closing before any radio now spread tasks, donations, small shifts of care. It was not romantic solidarity. It was survival organized by proximity, service traded for service, and food for time. The radio, when someone turned it on, spoke of numbers and distant speeches. The hallway spoke of who had a fever, who needed coal, who could not climb stairs, who had an extra piece of bread, and who knew where there was a day's work. And in that moment, that was the information that truly changed the next morning. In April, when Stanislav returned home, he climbed slowly, holding the railing. He had lost weight, and the shadow of his mustache looked larger on his thin face. The children were startled by the way he walked. Helena hugged him carefully, as if he were made of glass. Yosef, who did not understand, laughed and tugged at his father's coat. Maria watched the scene without exaggerated expression. Inside, she was doing the accounts again, but now with a fixed variable. Her husband's body would not be the same, and that changed the math of the month, of the next winter, of what could be promised without lying. The rent fell behind again in May. Mrs. Donnelly came up the stairs and spoke, this time with less patience. Maria did not beg. She offered work, cleaning the hallway, washing the stairs, tending the yard. The landlady agreed to reduce part of it in exchange because she also needed to keep the building running and someone had to do the work. Maria began scrubbing the hallway boards every Monday, on her knees, feeling the smell of water with bleach rise. The bleach burned her nose and hands, but left the floor with an appearance of order, and an appearance of order was a way of keeping the house standing. As she scrubbed, she heard the conversations behind doors. Men talking about going west to look for work, women talking about returning to relatives' homes, children asking why meat had disappeared from the plate. The hallway was an organism, and Maria was now one of the hands that kept it working with rag, bucket, and discipline, as if discipline were the last asset that could not be pawned. In summer, the heat brought temporary relief. It was not necessary to buy as much coal. The windows stayed open, and sounds came in from the street. Vendors, short laughter, arguments. The smell of warmed garbage and fried food rose from the alley. Maria found steady work at a small laundry near Ashland Avenue, where steam made the air heavy and the body always damp, and where heat clung to the skin even when you stepped outside. She left early, came back late, and her hands became marked by small burns from hot water and irons. Helena, after school, took care of Yosef, learning tasks that were not for a child. Heating water, watching a pot, keeping her brother away from the stove. Stanislav stayed home, making small repairs, trying to feel useful. In time, he began doing clothing adjustments for neighbors. Hems, buttons, patches on coats. It was little money, but it came with people knocking on the door for a reason that was not pity. When someone arrived with trousers and a few coins, Stanislav straightened his shoulders as much as he still could, as if the gesture were part of the payment, as if usefulness returned a piece of dignity the bullet had taken. At the end of October, a forgotten newspaper in the hallway carried headlines about unemployment and banks. Maria stepped over the paper to scrub a stain on the floor and noticed how the larger world insisted on explaining what the hallway had already lived in the flesh. Western Electric and Cicero continued with fewer shifts. Many men never returned. Stanislav's name would not return to any list, not with that wounded lung. Maria's mother's necklace would not come back from pawn. Mr. O'Brien would not return to the front step with his old newspaper. These things had become facts, not possibilities, and fact was what could not be negotiated, what did not reverse itself with hope. Even so, the apartment existed. The pine table remained in the same place. The old stove still warmed, even with less coal and more ash. The children grew, and growth was a kind of stubbornness that did not ask permission. Helena received a used satchel from the teacher and began bringing books home. At night, she read aloud, slowly, and the reading filled the room with a sound different from the distant radio, a sound of school and of a possible future, even if the future had become a difficult word. Stanislav listened with his eyes closed, sometimes correcting a word in low Polish when Helena stumbled over an English pronunciation. Maria sewed, mending socks, mending shirts, mending what she could, and then she left the thread suspended in the air just to listen to that child's voice that could still concentrate on clean pages. As if concentration were a luxury, she insisted on keeping inside the home, a luxury that protected the mind when the body already lived at the limit. At the end of December, On an afternoon when fine snow fell and the light made the hallway too bright, Maria finished washing the stairs and stopped for an instant halfway. The doors were closed, but smells came out from under them. Fried onion, soup, weak coffee, and also the smell of damp clothes drying indoors for lack of sun. She heard a baby cry somewhere, heard a cough, heard a short laugh that lasted only long enough to remind her there were still teeth and breath in that building. The tenement was poor, but alive, and it no longer seemed only a place where bad news arrived first. It was also a place where people learned to share what they knew and what they had, even when it was almost nothing, and where information was worth as much as a piece of coal, because information could become a decision, and a decision could become one more day. Maria went back into the apartment, took off her wet boots, and put another piece of coal in the stove, hearing the crackle and feeling the heat begin slowly. Stanislav sat at the table, sewing a button onto a shirt that was not his, with the calm concentration of someone who had found a possible task. Helena did her homework, her tongue caught at the corner of her mouth, and Yosef woke and came rubbing his eyes, asking for bread with the naturalness of someone who still believed asking was part of the day. Maria cut thin slices, spread a little lard and salt, and set one for each of them without ceremony. Outside, Chicago continued with its tracks, its smoke, and its men standing on corners. But in there the home had organized itself into work, care, and small services that brought honest coins. And when night closed the windows with cold, the family stayed at the table a few more minutes, eating slowly, listening to the hallway settle. And that was enough to end the year without grandeur, with the kind of relief the body recognizes when, despite everything, there is still a next morning and there is still a place to return to. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these often forgotten stories find the audience they deserve. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you as well. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This community stretches across places, generations, and personal histories, brought together by a shared respect for the past. Thank you for being here, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.